Good morning. Thanks for coming. I'm Bob Cusack, the editor-in-chief of The Hill. I first want to thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation for sponsoring this event. We're also live streaming on thehill.com, and invite all the guests, both who are watching on thehill.com as well as here, to join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag #OpportunityRoadmap. We have a great lineup of speakers this morning. I first want to introduce Congressman Van Hollen, who is the senior Democrat on the Budget Committee. He's a leadership official. He's been a campaign chief, and he's also running for the Senate. Please welcome Congressman Chris Van Hollen.
Thanks a lot.
Congressman, I first want to start off with really the news of the day and of the last few days. What has been your reaction to what's been going on in Baltimore the last several days?
Well, first of all Marylanders, and I think all Americans, have Baltimore City in their hearts and their prayers. And I think this is a wake-up call. What happened in Baltimore City with Freddie Gray, what we've seen in other cities around the country, about the need and the urgency to tackle some of the issues that we're talking about today. Mm-hmm. This is a question of trying to make sure that we have justice in America, and also get at the deeper issues that are underlying some of the profound problems we're seeing in Baltimore City and other places. And part of it is deep poverty. Part of it is the fact that the war on poverty that Johnson announced so many years ago has had many successes, but we have also not seen that promise fulfilled. And it also is a function of the fact that there's been a lot more focus on the war on drugs than the war on poverty. And I believe that it's been a fundamental mistake to treat the war on drugs as a criminal justice issue as opposed to a public health issue. And the result is you're seeing hundreds of thousands of people behind bars for non-violent drug offenses. So I guess my larger point, Bob, is that this is a constellation of issues that we need to address with a real sense of urgency in this country. And it shows that the budget debates are a lot more than about a lot more than just the numbers on the page. They go to fundamental policies.
Just on one question on the Baltimore, there's a lot of controversy about what happened. Do you think that it could have been handled better, should the National Guard have been brought in earlier, or do you think that it was handled as best as it could have been?
You know, I'm really not going to get into second guessing the leaders on the ground. Last night actually was a moment where the clergy came together, elected officials came together to begin to restore calm. And really, this is a moment where we all need to rededicate ourselves to trying to do a lot better and frankly tackle the issues that this conference that Annie Casey and the Hill have sponsored is all about. These fundamental questions of how do we provide more economic empowerment, more economic opportunity, both in the shorter term as well as in the longer term. And so it's a wake-up call, not just what's happening in Baltimore, but what's happened in other parts of the country, that we really need to renew the war on poverty and create new opportunities for more people who have been left behind.
Specifically on some of the remedies, what do you think are the big fixes that could be done? Is it changes to the tax code? Is it more money for Medicaid? What do you think are the top issues that would actually solve this problem?
So I think there are a combination of issues. Some are short-term because we need to be tackling this with a sense of immediacy and urgency, and some are long-term. So in the short term, we need to, first of all, to make sure that the current earned income tax credit bump up and the child tax credit bump up that the president has proposed do not expire. These are essential policies that provide more resources to working people and working people with families. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this has been something proposed by both the president as well as people like Paul Ryan, it's something I put forward in the Democratic alternative budget, which is to significantly increase the earned income tax credit for childless adults. Now, both of these policies are things that the Annie Casey Foundation has been committed to. And let me just mention on that second one, right now, if you're a single worker working full-time, you are still, in many cases, at least at the minimum wage, way below the poverty level. And so it's really essential that we make work pay. So those are two policies, but let me just say this. We also need to significantly increase the minimum wage. We need to restructure the tax code in a way that rewards work and not just return on capital. And we need to look at new incentives, like the President's Promise Zone proposals, to increase job growth in these urban areas through a series of tax incentives and other measures that both increase job opportunities and then also increase wages through minimum wage and changes in the tax code. Also, training. We need much more creative workforce training. We're beginning to move in the right direction with some of these partnerships between community colleges and employers, but we need to move even further. I've proposed additional tax incentives for businesses that have apprenticeship programs. So those are things that we need to move forward on to provide more job skills for people who are throughout the country. And finally, there's the long term. We really do need to invest a lot more in early education, starting right at the earliest ages. The President put forward a proposal a number of years ago. It's a proposal that, again, I've adopted as part of the Democratic alternative budget, which is to make sure that our kids from the earliest ages have an opportunity to be in an environment where there is learning. And so we've proposed about $70 to $80 billion investment as part of that, and we need to move forward on that in the country. So investing in early education as part of a long-term strategy, but also these immediate measures to improve workforce training, to encourage more jobs in urban areas where you have high unemployment.
Congressman, you've been a pivotal player in all the debates on the budget, and Republicans are close to, they've hit a bit of a snag, of coming together on the House and the Senate side to come up with a budget. Number one, what do you see in that budget that you like and don't like, and do you see any possible common ground?
So I'm afraid there's really not a lot to like in either the House Republican budget or the Senate Republican budget, and when you merge two bad budgets, there's no point in between that's good for the country. And let me just explain why. These budgets have massively disinvest in the country, and then they shred the social safety net. So on the investment side, they cut that part of the budget that we use to invest in things like education, invest in scientific research, invest in modernizing our infrastructure. They cut that by 40% below the lowest level we've seen since we've been keeping records as a share of the economy. Okay, so this is a massive disinvestment. At the same time that they're cutting our investment on the front end in terms of education, they are massively shredding the social safety net, including the food nutrition programs, including Medicaid. I mean, it's over almost $1 trillion cut in Medicaid over 10 years. And we're also told that this most recent proposal, the conference committee report of the House and the Senate, actually cuts the food nutrition programs even further below what the House did, which was already low. So if you're disinvesting from the front end on investment in education and then also shredding the social safety net, that is actually a recipe for putting a lot more people into poverty and eliminating opportunities. So this isn't a budget, by the way, that would cut the top tax rate. Green light a plan to cut the top tax rate for millionaires by 1/3, and a proposal which, as we saw the other day, also sort of is in conjunction with this proposal to cut the estate tax for estates over $10 million. So it's just these are not the priorities of the country right now. The priorities of the country are trying to grow our economy in a way that we have more shared prosperity for more Americans, not just tax cuts for folks at the top. So this is going to be a real battle for the heart and soul of the country. And I think that, on this one, I think, the Republican budget is very much on the wrong side of all these issues.
You mentioned President Johnson, and last year marked the 50th anniversary on the war on poverty, and the poverty rate has gone down. It's about 15% now. Estimated 50 million, though, remain in poverty. And your friend, Paul Ryan, he is your friend. You have a good personal relationship, though you differ dramatically on fiscal issues. Former chairman of the Budget Committee, now with Ways and Means. He said a very different view of what Democrats say on the war on poverty and whether it's worked. He said there's a lot of government overlap and government regulations, 92 programs costing $800 billion. Do you think that overall grade the war on poverty in its 51 years?
Oh, well, clearly it has not achieved the promise that it held out. But I should also hasten to add that if you did not have the policies that were put in place through the war on poverty, you'd have about 40 million more Americans in poverty. I mean, that is the assessment of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the report they put out on that anniversary. And that is a result of everything from Social Security to Medicare to food and nutrition programs. In other words, if you look at what's called market poverty, what would the poverty level be in families absent those programs? You'd probably have about the same poverty rate. In fact, I think it might be a little higher today than it was back then. So what that shows is that we've made very little progress when it comes to what we call market poverty, these things that are driven by wages and the income that people have through their work. We haven't seen much progress on that end, but we have seen that these programs have resulted in about 40 million people now not in poverty who would be in poverty. But look, when you have close to 50 million Americans in poverty, you got a real problem and crisis on your hands. And that is why we need to tackle this with more urgency. And there's the jobs piece and encouraging through the tax code more jobs in areas of high unemployment, things like enterprise zones, the President's Promise Zones proposal. Then there's the wage part, right? I mean, people have been working harder than ever. Productivity in the United States has risen dramatically over the last 30 years, but it has not translated into higher wages, higher pay, higher benefits, which is why I put forward a number of proposals to change the tax code so that we actually incentivize businesses to increase pay for their employees. It's called the CEO Employee Paycheck Fairness Act. There's no reason we should have a tax code that allows corporations to deduct bonuses for CEOs and executives over $1 million if those corporations are cutting pay for their workers or not allowing their workers to share in the increased productivity that their work is providing to the corporation. It makes no sense. So we need to increase the minimum wage, but we need to go way beyond that in changing our tax code, which right now rewards return on capital much more than return on hard work. And so that's a broad policy in connection with these things like making sure we keep the expansions to EITC, CTC, and adopt the proposal for childless adults with respect to EITC, so that when you're working, you're able, and working full time, you're not below the poverty level. I mean, that is a scandalous combination of policies, that you can work full time in the United States and still be below the federal poverty level. There are a number of things we can do today to change that, and it's scandalous that we haven't.
You're running for the Senate, 2016, a big election year. Do you think these issues are going to be front and center, and do you hear them from constituents? Do they raise these issues?
Yes, I think the whole question of trying to make sure we have an economy that works for everyone and not just folks at the very top end is absolutely going to be the fundamental conversation in our country going forward. And this is not a new problem. If you look at the data, you will find that over the last 3 decades, worker productivity has risen steadily. And for a long time, in the late 1950s to the late 1970s, that higher worker productivity translated into higher wages and higher pay for those workers. What you've seen since the late 1970s is this yawning gap, worker productivity going up, but their real pay for most workers flat. So the gains from that increased worker productivity have gone disproportionately to folks at the very top and not been more broadly shared. And we need to create new incentives in our economy to deal with this. That gap is a result of a number of factors. Part of it is globalization, more jobs going overseas, innovation, technology, but a good part of them, in my view, could be resolved through much better economic policies, changes to the tax code. I mean, we have a tax code that says that hedge fund managers get a better tax rate than people who are driving school buses or working hard through wage labor every day. Why should we have a tax code that rewards income from one better than income from another? That makes no sense. So we got to restructure these things. I do, Bob, also want to point out that there are these other policies beyond the budget that I think are having a negative impact. And I do think that the fact that we have so many Americans, especially minorities, who are in prison today for nonviolent drug offenses is also a national scandal. And if you look at our incarceration rates for nonviolent crimes, they're huge. And so we need to address the drug issues through a healthcare approach. I mean, Kurt Schmoke was the mayor of Baltimore many years ago. And in my view, he was really ahead of his time when he was talking about this very different approach to drugs, because simply locking somebody up for drug use does not solve the underlying problem. And what it does do is lead to real damage in many of these communities. So we need to tackle the issue of drugs, but we need to tackle it in a smart way with a health policy approach rather than a criminal justice approach. And because all these things are now interrelated. And we need to address them all. And
that's actually an area of bipartisanship. There's a proposal by Senator Lee and Senator Durbin on sentencing reform. Do you think that could be something that could move, that could be at least one of the many steps that are needed here?
Actually, I think this is something that there's some hope for. Bobby Scott, somebody who I've worked with closely on this issue, and he's just been tenacious in trying to move this conversation forward, as you mentioned, others have as well. I do think there's room for a bipartisan agreement. There have been a number of conversations already. There's legislation, and I'm hoping that this can be something that we're able to get done even in this polarized environment. And I think it would be a major step forward if we could. We also need to all the other pieces we're talking about here that are on the budget side, and investing in job opportunities, more incentives for businesses to create jobs in some of these high unemployment areas. We have a proposal that's been put forward by the Congressional Black Caucus that we've adopted as part of our budget proposal to channel more of these resources into areas of high chronic poverty, resources across the board that are provided at the federal level. This is a policy that needs to be really focused and really targeted.
Well, Congressman, thanks for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
All right, Congressman, take it easy. I want to introduce our next speakers. Patrick McCarthy is the President and CEO of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Michael Gerson, Visiting Fellow, the Center for Public Justice, and a columnist for the Washington Post. And we'll be having the conversation with Lisa Hamilton, Vice President, External Affairs with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Please welcome them.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Morning.
It's a pleasure to talk to you this morning about creating roadmaps to opportunity for young people. And I thought maybe we'd start by talking about where we are. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has been publishing the Kids Count data book for 25 years. And so, Patrick, I'd ask you to share with us what some of the progress is you've seen over those 25 years, some of the continuing challenges that we need to face to help young people succeed.
Sure, thanks, Lisa. You know, when you think about a successful business or any successful organization, the ones who do best are those who think about where the organization, where the business needs to be in 25 years. And I think it's useful for this country to think about where we want to be in 25 years. And if you think about the most important leading indicator economically, socially, morally as a country, you've got to think about how are the children doing. They are our leading indicator for where we're going to be in 25 years. So I just want to briefly touch on where we are in terms of kids' well-being in the areas of poverty and opportunity, communities, and families. Poverty and opportunity, we have some difficult statistics to confront. We've got half of the children in this country being born into families that are at risk of falling into poverty. They're at the 200% of federal poverty level. 1 in 5 kids are in families that are below the poverty line. 1 in 10 are in families that are in deep poverty, half the federal poverty line. So clearly we have lots of kids who face the barriers that come along with growing up in poverty, in brain development, in the opportunities for school success, et cetera. We also seem to have sort of more stickiness, if you will, at the bottom of the income ladder. So a kid growing up in a poor family in the bottom fifth is 5 times less likely to move to the top than a child who's born at the top is to move to the bottom. So you've got that kind of stickiness. If you think about the demography of the country, in just 3 years, more than half of our children will be in families of color. And in just 15 years, more than half of our workforce will be drawn from people of color. And so when you start to look at these same statistics through the lens of how are African Americans, Latinos doing, et cetera, and their children, 40% of African American children are in families who are poor, 1 out of 3 Latino children. So again, there are a lot more statistics, but I want to get across that since poverty is probably the biggest predictor of success, the biggest risk factor in whether kids do well, we should be deeply concerned about some of those stats. In communities, there's a lot that's been written about the suburbanization of poverty, the outer ring suburbs and cities. We also are seeing increasing segregation of poor folks and unemployed folks in particular areas within cities. As the city's cores tend to get wealthier, the outer rims of the city get poorer. 13% of children are now living in communities where more than 30% of the families around them are poor. As the congressman said, our approach to drug enforcement has led to mass incarceration, which disproportionately affects those very same communities. So when you have concentration of unemployed folks in a community, folks who are incarcerated, but remember, they come back. So you have folks who are not only being removed from the community and incarcerated, but then they come back having experienced incarceration and with the barriers that they face all the more difficult. And so we've got a lot of trends in the community front that we ought to be concerned about. And I think the combination of the trends in opportunity and poverty and the trends in communities start to drive some of what we're seeing in our family lives. In fact, 1 out of 3 American children are growing up in single-parent families. Among African American children, it's 2 out of 3 are growing up in single-parent families. Now, we obviously need to reverse those trends. Clearly, we've seen teen pregnancy come down, which is a terrifically positive sign. But I would point out that even as we figure out what we can do to help turn around the trends towards the lack of two-parent family formation. We also have to recognize that single-parent families need different kinds of supports, and we need to invest in that. So I'll stop there. I know that Michael has lots of other perspectives on this. So.
Well, Patrick, one of the issues you brought up is the numbers of children who are born into poverty who really struggle to raise their economic prospects going forward. Michael, you've written a bit about Robert Putnam's recent book, Our Kids, and your reaction to his conversation about income inequality. Could you share some of your thoughts about the issues raised in that book?
Well, I'm really hopeful that Bob's book could spark a new discussion on this issue. His diagnosis is meticulously non-ideological. He talks about this as a perfectly purple problem. Okay, so red state people have insights, blue state people have insights in this, as you were describing. We have a problem that is affecting the collapse of the blue-collar economy in many places, which has a set of radiating effects, the atomization of community, kind of failure of community, and then the family structural problems that you're talking about, really a two-tier family structure in America, with more educated and wealthy people having a form of kind of the traditional family, kind of neo-traditional approach to the family, and people in the working class having those structures under real stress, toxic stress. So I guess in essence, Bob's argument is that Americans are generally willing to live with a degree of inequality in a society where there's social mobility. But in a society without social mobility, inequality becomes a caste system in which birth equals destiny. And that's deeply inconsistent with the American ideal. The scary thing about Bob's book is that he's describing social conditions now, which we're going to see the results of 15 and 20 years in the future. And he really fears what he calls a mobility cliff, where the situation will get dramatically worse. He actually compares it to global warming, about where conditions decades ago determined what's happening now, and conditions now will determine the situation decades to come. And that's his concern. So it is an alarm bell. The book is an alarm bell. I think it creates some common ground of diagnosis, incorporating, I think, a really sophisticated, broad conception of what went wrong. And what he's hoping for is a virtuous competition of ideas from right and left to address these problems. And that is what needs to happen now. There are some green shoots of thought on poverty issues on the right. They're not fully grown. But that has to be part of the next step, is to determine if we can agree on diagnosis, and I think we should be able to, then we can start a kind of competition of ideas on solutions.
What do you think the prospects are for bipartisan approaches to dealing with poverty and opportunity?
Well, I think we have a pretty partisan debate in Washington on these issues. It concerns me a little that, for example, that there aren't House Republicans or Senate Republicans who are really anxious to speak at events like this and bring their own perspective on these issues. But you do have Paul Ryan and Marco Rubio and Senator Lee and some members of the House who are beginning to address this set of issues and understanding an element of the diagnosis here, which is we really do face a problem that is a uniquely modern problem brought on by globalization and technology, in which lower skill workers have a very tough time in our economy finding jobs that will lead to a dignified life. That's a basic change in our economy. And so there are a number of conservatives that are talking about they would rather do wage subsidies like EITC than minimum wage, so there's some disagreement. But I think some recognition that we have an economic crisis, a long-term economic crisis, that's put downward pressure on wages and job participation in the workforce. And that is something that we just have to deal with along with the other social issues.
So Patrick, let me ask you about this issue Michael raises about economic opportunity, particularly for teens and young adults. As we watch the situation unfold in Baltimore over the last few days, the engagement of young people was certainly something that a lot of folks were concerned about and want to engage on. Could you talk a bit about what you see the prospects for this cohort of young adults that we've got to make sure gets on the right path to opportunity?
Sure. So just to remind us all, Freddie Gray was a 25-year-old young man. And we often use this term connected by 25, by which we mean if a young person is going to be successful, they need to be connected to the workforce, connected to family, connected to their community, contributing to community by the time they're 25. When you, as many of us did, watched what unfolded on Monday night, so many of the people involved in the unrest and the rioting that occurred and the looting, et cetera, were essentially very young folks. We've got almost 7 million young people between 16 and 24 in this country who are neither in school nor attached to the workforce. 7 million. Their prospects are dim if we don't figure out how to invest in them. I would just want to pick up on some of Michael's observations. I think there are some really deep thinkers across the ideological spectrum, but increasingly from folks who identify as conservatives, really raising up things that haven't been talked about or considered in a very long time. The challenge, I think, is to take that thinking, to bring all of our best thinking to bear. On the political side, what makes that difficult is, in addition to the natural partisanship, which is, of course, it's politics, so there's partisanship. But what makes it particularly difficult is everyone in this country, but especially folks in the public limelight, have great difficulty in talking about race. And the reality is we are well past the time, hundreds of years literally, but we are just running out of time to deal effectively with issues of race and racism in this country. And that makes it particularly difficult, I think, for folks who are politically active to take on these issues. And it couldn't be more clear as we think about not only the problems in Baltimore, but the solutions in Baltimore. And these young folks, especially young men of color, who are at such risk.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would only add one thing. It's not a disagreement. It's one of the kind of sub-themes of Bob's book, is that a lot of the social problems we're diagnosing, we're seeing happen first and hardest in the African American community, but they're not just there now. In fact, this is become a much broader problem that is really more a class problem. And so that doesn't mean that criminal justice and historical wrongs, that we don't deal with issues of race. But it does mean that we have increasingly a problem that affects maybe a third of Americans that don't exit this young adulthood like you're talking about with the skills and social capital necessary to compete in the modern economy. And that is a massive disaster. So it's not either or, but it's race plus.
Yeah, so. And it really, that's exactly right. And it helps us see that many of the things that we have historically tended to say is a cultural problem among African Americans or Latinos, et cetera. It's clear that that's not the case,
Exactly.
that there are huge economic trends and changes that we are all caught up in. And so perhaps we can be much more not only compassionate but intelligent about how we think about solutions.
So let's talk about solutions. Patrick, give us some sense of what the foundation believes can work to help young people get on a better path to opportunity.
Right. So like many folks across the country, we think this is a two-generation opportunity to intervene. And by that, we don't mean it's going to take 2 generations, but rather that you've got to simultaneously invest in families and in children. So we've got to have immediate attention to the economic problems. And of course, as the Congressman said, the Casey Foundation is very much in support of expanded EITC, child tax credit, paying attention to food and nutrition, all the, not just safety net programs, but those programs that encourage work and reward work and have attachment to the workforce. Much more to say about that than we have time for. But I do want to say that if you simultaneously think about the children in those families and invest in things that we have evidence that work, like high quality, and all of these have to be high quality, home visiting, early childhood programs, bringing the community together to work around shared problems in education, like attendance, like out-of-school time and how that should be spent, investing heavily in that 16 to 24 age group because they are, in fact, many of them, the parents of the most vulnerable young children. And that investment is, by its very nature, a 2-generation investment. And finally, we have to remember that folks we're trying to work with are carrying dual roles. They are parents and they are employees. And sometimes those things conflict. We've got to figure out how to not only make work pay, but how to make work work, that parents, in fact, can attend to their needs as parents as they are employers, or as employees, or if they're involved in the programs we're trying to provide to help them, that we don't just think about a job training program as a job training program. What about the kids? How are we thinking about investing simultaneously in their children?
One thing I admire about Casey is their recognition that we're not just dealing with the state and individuals. We're also dealing with a civic sector that is essential both in the diagnosis of problems, but in the solution to problems. That includes families, the faith-based community. I was just in Baltimore yesterday, met with some faith-based leaders that are confronting what's going on there. They bring an essential, unique perspective to these debates, a perspective that humanizes everyone, including those involved in criminal activities. It's a real contribution. I think it's important to recognize we're dealing with the civic sector. One of the startling and interesting things about Bob's use of examples in his book, examples of young people that are scattered throughout the book, is we have a huge series of social problems, major economic problems, major community problems, major family problems. But the way that children experience this crisis is often the lack of committed long-term adults in their life. That's where the rubber hits the road in Bob's description. And so things like nurse-family partnership that help young mothers to be responsible parents going forward. Things like social-emotional learning, where you're getting responsible, committed adults in children's lives in productive ways. These are, I think, need to be a focus of what we're talking about. If you're going to take seriously the lived experience of children, it's often an experience of abandonment. It's a very sad, heartbreaking thing in the book. And so we need all these sectors to be working together, government, the civic sector, and then individuals, in order to be consistent presence, be a consistent presence in the lives of children.
Well, thank you both for your perspectives on where we are, solutions we need to explore, and a call to action to everyone to help keep our young people moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I next want to introduce Doug O'Brien, to my immediate right, Senior Policy Advisor for Rural Affairs, Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Isabel Sawhill, Co-Director, Center on Children and Families at the Brookings Institution. Thanks for coming. Isabel, I want to start with you. What do you think the role of poverty is playing in the Baltimore crisis situation right now?
Well, I think Chris Von Hollen really said it well. He said that's the fundamental problem underlying this kind of senseless violence. And we look at the senseless violence, and many citizens, I'm afraid, look at that and get both discouraged about what policy can do, and also maybe not so friendly in their thoughts about these young men who are not making it to age 25 with the kind of supports they need, as Patrick McCarthy pointed out. So, you know, there's a political ramification to this that on the one hand is a wake-up call, but on the other may actually turn some voters against social programs.
In what way?
I think it's a further stereotyping of young black males, frankly.
Doug, the Domestic Policy Council, it's got a big fancy name. What does it actually do day to day?
It helps coordinate domestic policy throughout all the different agencies in the federal government. I work right now on rural affairs for the Domestic Policy Council, and in particular I focus on the work of the White House Rural Council. So it's the group of cabinet members that have some responsibility to implement programs in rural places, and that's just about all of them. Recently, the White House Rural Council, and the chair is Secretary Tom Vilsack at the Department of Agriculture. And Secretary Vilsack, in fact, partly because of some of the things that he saw in a kids count report from Annie E. Casey, and I think it was September, October, and it began a conversation with others in the White House about focusing the efforts of the White House Rural Council on rural child poverty, really echoing a lot of the things that we've already talked about this morning, that when we think about the future of communities, and in particular the work I do in rural communities, and we think about those assets that are most important 25 years down the road, as Patrick talked about, a lot of times we talk about infrastructure or the current workforce, or in rural places, the natural resources. But, one could argue that the most important asset are those young kids. They are going to be the greatest determination on whether those communities are successful in the future.
Isabel, you mentioned stereotypes. What are the biggest fallacies and misperceptions of poverty?
Well, to go back to the race issue again, one of the biggest misconceptions or stereotypes is that most people that are poor are also black. And of course, the majority of the poor in America are white. And we, I think, do have a problem politically in our country because of the history of race, that we are less willing than, say, European countries to address these issues. I mean, if you compare the U.S. to other advanced countries, we are doing a terrible job in all kinds of areas. Very high infant mortality, much stingier safety net, hugely higher rates of incarceration. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Doug, along those lines, what is the difference between urban poverty and rural poverty?
Well, that's a great question. I know Isabel's an expert on this, and she can elucidate farther than I can. But it's a really interesting question because it points up how to measure poverty. In rural places, on the official poverty rate, that doesn't look at most of the income transfer payments, in particular the earned income tax and the supplemental nutrition assistance program. And if you don't account for those, in rural places, poverty is actually quite a bit worse. And for kids in particular, it's about 1 out of 4 kids who live in poverty, and 1 out of 8 kids who live in deep poverty. But if you look at the supplemental poverty measure, that does include some of those and many of the critical programs, rural places actually have a lower rate of poverty than the population in general, which I think it's a real example of both how important and in many ways successful the federal programs have been in rural places. Just a couple more stats. In 1959, right before the war on poverty, 47% of the people, according to the official poverty rate, in rural places lived in poverty. If you use apples to apples in 2012, that rate was more along the lines of about 17%. I mean, that's a real success. Millions of people, that have been lifted out of poverty. But at the same time, as has been talked about this morning, as President Obama has talked about many times, there is so much more work to be done, and that work is reflective. Congressman Dan Helen talked about it this morning in the priorities in the president's budget, in the FY16 budget, around earned income tax credits, around child care tax credits, around minimum wage, and around investments in workforce development, and particularly community colleges.
I was looking up President Obama's promises about poverty from PolitiFact, and actually they gave him passing grades of keeping his promises in 9 out of 13 categories. Just say something nice about your boss. I know I have to twist your arm, but what are his biggest accomplishments on this area? You mentioned what has to be done, minimum wage, but what has been done already?
Well, I think the expansion of the earned income tax credit and child care tax credit has, I think I was looking at some statistics recently, it's actually decreased the number of kids in poverty in particular by about 3%. That's a huge one. It's one, it was talked about this morning how important it is to make sure to extend that expansion in tax credits. There's been, as now we've come out of the general recession, although as the president and so many others have said, the increase in economic activity hasn't been fairly shared, but during the president's term, work on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program lifted literally millions and millions of kids out of poverty and make sure they had access to nutritious food. Just a couple of examples.
We were talking earlier with the congressman on the war on drugs, something that former President Bill Clinton has expressed actually some regret on. Isabel, how does that factor into this conversation, as well as sentencing reform, which has been a bipartisan initiative?
Well, I'm not an expert on the war on drugs, but obviously I think that there is, as has already been said, some coming together across party lines about the need for sentencing reform. And they're obviously related in the sense that all of these nonviolent crimes that have ended people up in prison, often for many, many years, have really broken communities apart, broken families apart, cost the government a bundle of money, and probably been just plain unjust. So we need to change that.
Isabel, as far as when you think of poverty, what do you see? What is the visual? You mentioned a lot of white people are on poverty. People don't know that. And I know that the Census Bureau counts, there's a certain way of how you define poverty. But when you think of it, what do you think of? Do you think of a hungry child? Do you think of someone who who can't get a job? What is the face of poverty?
Well, I'd like to go back to what Michael Gerson said about Bob Putnam's book, because I think we can get terribly wrapped up in these statistics. Those of us who are policy wonks, we love to talk about, well, the poverty rate is such and such officially, and it's this other amount if you include all the non-cash transfers, and it's something else again if you're talking about deep poverty. And I can play that statistical game too, but I think it's better to go back and think about Bob's book, and I would commend it to anyone who hasn't seen it, because there are real profiles of real people in the book. And what he shows is not only do we have growing income inequality, which I think everybody knows, but we have growing gaps in so many other areas. We have growing gaps in family structure. We have, the lack of stable, committed parents in so many children's lives, and that's a growing problem. We have growing gaps in parenting styles. We have well-educated parents spending lots of time with their kids, reading to them, talking to them, taking them places, introducing them to all kinds of resources. And you have poorer and less educated parents who are working several jobs, or there's only one earner in the family, and they don't have the time to do that, and they often don't have the social capital and other background to do that. So you then have huge growing gaps in test scores in school between kids from higher income and lower income families. You have a growing gap in who's going to college and who's not. And you have a very sharply growing gap in who's graduating from college and who's not. So we're becoming a more class-based, bifurcated society. And I therefore prefer to think about, you know, the road to opportunity rather than just focusing on poverty itself. Because, as I think Michael Gerson said, if you can't close these gaps, or at least prevent them from growing, you're going to threaten the American ideal that we are a society in which anybody who works hard and has a certain amount of talent can make it. And you know, we're becoming a much more stratified society, and that's very worrisome.
But along those lines, what are the top 2 to 3 solutions that will address
Well, I'm an economist, and although not only for that reason, top of my list would be jobs. And how do we get more jobs? Well, first we have to have more sensible macroeconomic policies. In recent years, fiscal policy has been a disaster. I don't know how many people know, but in 2013, which by the way is the last year at which we have poverty data for, there's a lag here. In 2013, because of our fiscal policies, which were tightening in the middle of the aftermath of a recession when unemployment rates were still very high, that shaved 1.5 percentage points off of our GDP and probably lost us about 1 million jobs. And so, you know, that's hard to see, that kind of the effects of macroeconomic policy, but it could not be more critical. Now, we're doing a little better now. At least fiscal policy is not destroying jobs. I would actually, on the job front, want to experiment with something that we did as part of the Recovery Act. We gave states money. They were emergency TANF funds, and the states used a lot of that money to create jobs. They mostly created them in the private sector. They were subsidized jobs. And they did it a little bit differently in different states, but it was much more successful than I, for example, would have ever expected. And I think we should go back to a policy that says not only do we need to make work pay and make work work, and I hope we can come back to the make work work because we do need paid leave and more child care, but which this administration is very good on. But we also need to make work available for people who can't find it otherwise. And you know, we could toughen up. A lot of conservatives really want to toughen up on eligibility for certain safety net programs. You know, maybe they want to say, well, you can't get food stamps or SNAP unless you are working. Well, I would go along with some of that conditionality if we had a jobs program. So if someone said, I can't find a job, we had a job to put them in. It's an administrative challenge, but I think we need to move in that direction. I think all those young men we've been talking about, including the ones in Baltimore, if they had jobs, it would be a different story.
Doug, looking at big picture, the unemployment rate has gone down. The black unemployment rate, though, is very, very high. Is it jobs? Is it paid leave? What are the top issues that need to get done and need to get done in the short term?
Well, I think, I mean, I'd have to agree with Isabel that it's a comprehensive approach. I think what the administration has proposed and what it's done in the last 6 years in terms of job creation, not only Recovery Act, but certainly as that first focus in terms of growing the economy, but focusing on the families and the communities, moving away from the macroeconomics, focusing on the families in terms of the earned income tax credit, child care tax credit, a lot more investment in early childhood education. These things are efforts that are proven to be successful and a lot of people agree on. Focusing on the community, just yesterday the administration announced the second round designees of the Promise Zones. Promise Zones are an effort for the federal government to have a deeper and more robust engagement with communities in persistent poverty. And by that I mean it's focusing on communities who have a strategy for results. What the federal government does is provide priorities or set-asides for a plethora of federal programs for those communities. We place VISTA or AmeriCorps volunteers with those communities to increase their capacity. And at the end of the day, the federal government's a better supporter of that local solution for the community and for those families. A huge piece of that is also tax cuts for the businesses in that Promise Zone as proposed, again, in the president's budget. So I think it's different levels of family, community, macroeconomics. And at the same time, the administration's been very deliberate about not every solution is going to fit everywhere. That's why the White House Rural Council is working with HHS, the Department of Labor, certainly the U.S. Department of Agriculture, many other agencies on what can they do to tweak their programs, to craft their programs to meet the rural reality. At the same time, other programs within the Obama administration, such as My Brother's Keeper, meets the reality of young boys and men of color. Generation Indigenous is a comprehensive effort to deal with the real challenges, and that actually hasn't even been mentioned yet, in tribal country. Some generational challenges that I think this administration has stepped up to more than any. So there's a lot of things that need to be done. There are some proven solutions, and I think we can get some things done in the next couple of years.
Listen, I think that talking about what's going on, both the Affordable Care Act, something we haven't talked about, Medicaid expansion, what is the role, what are you seeing at the state and local level? Because, Washington loves to talk about Washington and what we're doing here.
Right.
But what do you see, what's the data out there? How much flexibility do states, governors have to deal with this, to create jobs?
Right, well, to create jobs and to provide opportunity to invest in kids and families. And of course, it varies a lot by program, right?
Sure.
I mean, whether the Affordable Care Act, which is, lifted millions of families in however you measure it, lifted families, into a place where they can access a critical service for their future, and that's making sure that they can get decent health care. A lot of these programs really do depend on states, for urban areas, mayors, for rural areas, county executives, on how they administer and some of the choices that they make. I think we've certainly seen this play out maybe most expressly in how some governors have chosen to implement the Affordable Care Act and some of the ramifications that that's had for some of the poorest families. That's something that we're working on, that Secretary Vilsack is working on in the White House Rural Council. Part of the strategy on rural child poverty is simply to lift up to other policymakers at different levels the implication that their choices have on the families, on the communities in rural places. We talked about, and Isabel did a great job of laying out really a critical issue in terms of family structure. And how important is some of the evidence that's there. I think that the choices that, whether you're a local, a state, or a federal policymaker, there's a lot of evidence in the things that Isabel talked about in early child care education, in voluntary home visiting, that I think all policymakers can get behind. One thing I did want to mention is another program, and Patrick mentioned it, and that's an approach on supporting families at a two-generation level. And we think, that's that idea, as Patrick described, that local state and federal service providers work together in a way to serve the whole family. So if you have a kid in early Head Start, make sure you're taking advantage of that interaction with the family so that the mom or the dad have access to financial literacy, have access to workforce development, have access to, to services that are there, but take advantage of that. Set up systems so that in a rural place, these things actually happen in the same place. I mean, it's a simple thing, and it's not a brand new idea. And there's some early evidence that shows great promise, but I think we really need to look at these promising practices. The White House Rural Council a couple weeks ago announced that we'll be looking at two-generation approaches. We're going to be looking at 10 places across the country to lift up places that are doing this, to provide them some extra technical assistance, make sure we learn the most that we can in the next few years about these promising practices.
Isabel, last question. What's the trends? What do you see? Poverty overall, we mentioned before, as the rate has gone down. But where are we headed?
It's a little discouraging right now. It's coming down a little bit. We have a projection model at Brookings that we use to try to look at trends in poverty and forecast them a little bit into the future. The poverty rate is very connected to the unemployment rate. They really do follow each other very closely, which is why, of course, I emphasize jobs, jobs, jobs. But our forecasting model shows some, continued decline as the unemployment rate comes down. But it's going to be quite a while, I think, before we're back to where we were before the Great Recession, much less back to where we were at an earlier period in our history. So based on the official poverty measure, we're not making a lot of progress. Now, when you include all those non-cash benefits that don't get counted in the official measure, as we discussed earlier, you see a lot more progress. And in fact, you see that during the Great Recession, the poverty rate didn't peak nearly as much as it would have if it hadn't been for the fact that the safety net worked so well during this last recession. I think where we've fallen short is the successes we've had is because we've grown these programs, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and like SNAP. We have not made progress in making people more self-sufficient through their own earnings and work. And so that's a problem. And I think the other thing we are fighting is the fact that every bit of progress we make through a successful program or a better economy is offset by two other things that are happening. One is this radical change in family formation I've already mentioned. And the other is the fact that the economy now demands highly skilled, well-educated workers, and we have not done a good job of fixing our education and training system to provide the skilled workers that employers need. And so until we can, I'd say, fix both of those problems, and that's a longer-term job or challenge, I think that we're going to be relying on the safety net programs to at least help people not suffer so much.
Well, I'd like to thank the NEEKC Foundation for this great event, and please thank Isabel, Doug, and all our speakers. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks, Bob.
Hey,
I enjoyed it.
Good job.